Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores human behavior through a behavioral science lens. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Thanks for taking a few minutes to hang out with us today. We know that there are millions of podcasts to listen to, and we're grateful you're choosing us.
Yeah, Tim. And let's do a quick shout out to the many people who have left us reviews recently. We really appreciate those ratings and reviews, and it's not for the reasons you think. It's not just because it's a big ego boost for us, Tim.
Wow, it sure feels good, though.
Of course it feels good, and we do really like the nice words being said about us and our work. However, when you leave a review or a rating, it impacts the algorithms that both Apple and Spotify use to offer suggestions to people who are just a bit curious about behavioral science podcasts.
So what you're saying is that leaving a review is like a pay it forward kind of thing, right?
Yeah, sort of. Everyone who leaves a nice review or a 5-star rating is actually helping other people learn about behavioral grooves.
Oh, well, that's cool. Okay, but the reason that you, meaning the listener, are actually listening today is to hear about our guest, Adam Zeman. Adam has a medical degree and a PhD in philosophy from Oxford University. He's been a lecturer and a professor of cognitive and behavioral neurology and has published extensively on visual imagery and forms of amnesia occurring during epilepsy.
Adam has also published an introductory to neurology for the general audience called A Portrait of the Brain. And more importantly, actually, most importantly, Adam was one of the researchers who identified the interesting medical condition regarding our mind's eye that we're going to talk about and name those conditions, one called aphantasia and one hyperphantasia, which is the reason why at least I really wanted to talk to him.
Yeah, okay, so what exactly is aphantasia, Kurt, and why is it so important to you?
Well, we'll hear from Adam in just a couple minutes talk about it, but the reason I'm interested in it is because I have it. I have aphantasia. And aphantasia describes how my brain works when it comes to active visual imagination and memory. So when you say the word elephant, a lot of people imagine the visual image of an elephant in their brains. People with aphantasia like me, we don't. I don't see anything, so I don't visualize that elephant in my brain.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Okay, but you remember images like the faces of your kids and you recognize the pizza shop on the corner stuff, right?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I can describe to you what an elephant looks like or my daughter's face, but I don't visually see them in my mind even if I close my eyes. It's more like a description for me being read in a book. An elephant has a trunk. It's gray. It's huge with large legs and large ears and a skinny tail.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And our conversation with Adam gets into what's happening in the brain as we process these things.
Okay, so Groovers, it's time to sit back with a fresh pour of fascinating ideas on how we visualize and remember the world, or in my case, don't visualize the world, and listen to our conversation with Adam Zeman.
Adam Zeman, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you very much.
We are glad to have you here, and we would like to get started with a little speed round. We'd like to first ask, are you a coffee guy or a tea guy?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, both really, but I guess tea if I had to choose. Certainly first thing in the day.
Oh, okay. Are you a little bit of both? Is that?
Yeah, a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's we have that answer quite often, so it's okay. If you had to choose between having dinner with your favorite athlete, musician, or actor, who would you pick to go to dinner with?
Probably musician.
Okay. Oh, excellent.
You've just piqued Tim's interest, and now he's going to be going all over that. So there you go.
I'll hesitate since this is the speed round on further questions, but we might come back to that later. Okay, so when it comes to living a good life, is psychological richness more important than happiness and meaning?
Wow, all very important. I'll go for psychological richness. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Love that. More on that.
All right. Last speed round question. We're going to get into some different things. So in your opinion, does having aphantasia limits one's ability to be successful in the world?
Absolutely not.
This is good. As a aphantasia myself, I am glad that that's the answer. But you have done a fantastic amount of research, actually coining the term. And I'd just like to start off, if my first question, real big question to you is, can you tell us about your research with patient MX and how that kind of led you into this world of aphantasia?
Yes, certainly. So I encountered MX about 20 years ago. He was referred to a neurology clinic because he had lost his mind's eye. He'd lost the ability to visualize. I was handed the referral letter, in fact, by the head of my department, who said, Adam, I think this is your kind of thing. He knew that I was interested in slightly unusual neurological symptoms, and this to me was very unusual. I hadn't come across loss of the ability to visualize before at all. So I was intrigued to meet MX, and indeed he gave a very compelling description. He was a very intelligent man in his mid-60s. He'd previously visualized very vividly. He's quite artistic. He used to enter a vivid visual world when he read a novel. He used to visualize to help get himself to sleep, and he'd lost all those elements of visualization abruptly following a procedure on his heart, a coronary angioplasty. So I was intrigued. After a while, I got around to looking at the neurological literature and discovered that this symptom had in fact been described over the previous century, but it was fairly rare. And MX was a really ideal research participant because he was very sort of even-tempered and articulate and interested in what we were in the possibility of research. So we spent quite a long time working with him, and in the end did a functional brain imaging study in which we showed that whereas most people, when they try to visualize, activate visual parts of the brain, MX did not, even though when he looked at things, he activated visual parts of his brain normally. Huh. So there was a kind of disjunction between visualization and vision in his case.
Very interesting. And then that got caught up in and correct me if I'm not following the kind of progression of this, but that got taken up by, was it Science Magazine or?
It was a science journalist called Carl Zimmer, who works mainly for the New York Times, but he wrote a piece in Discover.
Discover, that's it.
Which I think is sort of an American equivalent of Our New Scientist, isn't it?
Yeah.
He wrote a very nice piece about the paper we published on MX and the brain imaging study we did. And then over the course of the next few years, I and my co-authors had a kind of trickle of messages from people saying, I'm just like this guy. And I always have been. I've always recognized that there's something a little bit different about me. When other people reminisce about last year's holiday or their wedding or the last party they went to, they seem to be having an experience which is a bit visual. And I don't get that at all. So they'd often realized that they were a little different for many years. They also very often said, when people talked about seeing with the mind's eye, I'd always assumed that was a metaphor.
Yeah.
Now I realize it's literal.
That's exactly my take. I was always like, oh, well, that's just a metaphorical. Yeah, I can remember things. I just don't visualize them when I remember them. And so I thought that was a metaphorical take. So,
and they said they'd never seen the point of counting sheep
because they can't see them.
Yeah. So over time, we had about 21 or so contacts of that kind, and we did a couple of things. One was to send everyone who got in touch the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, which is just a way of quantifying the subjective vividness of imagery. And these folk were all scoring down at 16/80, which is floor, the lowest possible score. So essentially, when invited to visualize a series of scenes, they were saying that they just thought about them. There was no visualization, no visual experience. And then we sent a sort of common sense questionnaire asking a variety of questions, probing possible associations, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about. And then when we wrote about these folk, we decided that there needed to be some term to describe this phenomenon, because there wasn't one. There were one or two rather unwieldy terms in the literature, like defective revisualization and visual irreminiscence, which we didn't think were terribly catchy.
I know.
So I consulted a friend of mine who studied classics, and he suggested that we plunder Aristotle and borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, which is phantasia, tag an A on it on the end, tag an A at the front, and that was how aphantasia was born, as a description of absence of the mind's eye. And we described these 21 folk as examples of lifelong or congenital aphantasia. And it sounds as if you may be in that same band.
Well, it's fascinating. So oftentimes, especially in the world of behavioral types of things, whether it's neuroscience or psychology or even sociology, we see a lot of the researchers are acting on sort of a me search approach. Like they're interested in a topic because they are seeing the world in a particular way. That's not the case for you.
It's not. I have a very average score on the VVIQ. I'm neither aphantasic nor hyperphantasic. That's the term we coined to describe people at the other end of the spectrum who say that for them, visualization is as vivid as real as seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know in some of your talks I've listened to, you describe aphantasia maybe as not just one thing. Am I understanding your kind of take on that you're again potentially on causes, but also in just how it manifests itself? Are you
Absolutely. I'm sure I think it's a feature of experience, and I think it can occur in a number of different contexts and with a number of different associations. So I guess one key element, sort of dimension of variation, has to do with whether it just affects vision or whether it affects all the senses. And in fact, although our focus initially was on vision, it turns out that most people with aphantasia, not by no means all, but most, seem to lack sensory imagery across the board. So most people with aphantasia say they don't have much of a mind's ear or a mind's fingertip or a mind's nose, so to speak. There are some people who say it just affects vision and they can actually hear a symphony in their head perfectly well. But the majority in our work, the majority of folk with aphantasia seem to have weak or absent imagery across the board. So that's one respect in which there's some variation. Another is that a group of people with aphantasia describe really serious difficulties with face recognition. They have prosopagnosia, but that seems to be a specific subgroup. There's another group who say that they have really very thin autobiographical memory. That seems to be a more common association, but again, it's certainly not present in everyone. There's a group of people with aphantasia who are on the autistic spectrum, so another subgroup. And then another respect in which there seems to be variability is with respect to dreaming. And this is really interesting, I think. So the majority of people with aphantasia dream visually. Yeah. So they know what imagery is like from their dreams, even though they can't conjure imagery during the waking day. Wow. That's not true of everyone. There's a group of sort of 15 or so, 20% of people with aphantasia who say they don't dream at all, and there are people who dream in avisual ways. They dream in plot or in emotion. So yes, I think it's likely to be a bit of a mixed bag, and that isn't too surprising because the neural networks that are involved in visualization are quite complex, and you'd expect them to be able to break down in more than one way.
Which totally makes sense, right? That it's not a simple answer, but when you think about sort of the factors that lean towards the aphantasia, what percentage of the population do you think have some lack of primary visualization of primary imagery?
So I think it's somewhere around 3% of people fall into our aphantasic group. It depends a bit on how you define it. At the moment, it's really defined on the basis of subjective report. Essentially, we can talk about other ways of trying to diagnose it, so to speak, but it's primarily defined on the basis of subjective report. And there's a question about where you put your cutoff. So if you're using the VVIQ, you could restrict the term to people who score 16 at floor. We've been accepting people who score up to 23. The average score is about 58. So, if you're in the 20s, you're still way down, much lower than most.
And then on the opposite side, the hyperphantasia, again, is that included in that 3%, or is that a different number there?
That's a different number. So around 3% are aphantasic. Hyperphantasia seems to be rather more common. So if you look at the kind of bell curve for imagery vividness, it's crowded up towards the top end. There are more people with high scores than there are with very low scores.
Oh, interesting.
Again, the percentages depend on where you put your cutoff, but somewhere between 5 and 10% of people would fall into the hyperphantasic group.
And I want to make sure that for our listeners, we explain hyperphantasia, because it as the aphantasia is the lack of a mind's eye. Hyperphantasia is, how would you describe that?
Hyperphantasia is having an exceptionally vivid mind's eye. So if you're rating yourself on that vividness questionnaire, if you give yourself a score out of 1 out of 5 for a particular image, that says that you can't see anything, you're just thinking about it. If you give yourself a score of 5 out of 5, that says that the image is as vivid as if you were really seeing it. And there are people who score 80 over 80. That's to say when they visualize, their experience is as if they were looking.
I can't imagine that. That's just blows my mind, as I'm sure it blows. I mean, when I talk to people about having this, it blows their mind that there isn't a visual image at all. As I'm thinking about something or trying to like if somebody asks me, visualize an apple, I don't. I close my eyes and it is blank. It is, I can describe the apple. I can tell you what an apple looks like. I can do all of those things. I could draw an apple, but for me to visualize it inside of my brain it's not there. So
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because clearly your brain knows what apples look like because you can recognize them. So the information is there, but somehow you can't use that information to generate the sensory experience which most people have when they visualize.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. You had talked about obviously using the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire to kind of do a self-assessment on this, but there are other ways that researchers are looking at identifying these. Can you talk a little bit about some of those?
Yes, sure. So the person who's done most work on this is an Australian vision researcher called Joel Pearson, who works in Sydney.
Yeah.
I'll tell you about the couple of approaches that he's developed most recently, because I think they're rather sort of vivid in a way, and then come on to where he started. So one bit of work that they've done very recently, which I think is really, really neat, involves looking at pupillary responses.
Yeah.
So if you're a visualizer, and you imagine looking into the sun, your pupils will constrict. If you imagine looking into a dark cupboard, your pupils will dilate. That doesn't happen in people with aphantasia. So that's a nice objective correlate. Wow. A second interesting correlate has to do with, curiously, responses to fearful stories.
Yeah.
So Joel and his colleagues read a series of participants, really, really scary stories. I must say I don't recommend them. I didn't enjoy reading them.
Okay.
They made my flesh creep. And most people, when they're reading these stories, will sweat. So they'll have a galvanic skin response. People with aphantasia don't. And Joel's explanation for that is that what mediates between the story and the skin response is the visualization. And there's a nice control condition in that study showing that when people with aphantasia look at scary pictures, they do have a skin response. So it's not that you can't mount it. It's that you aren't producing the mediating image which allows you to sweat when you hear a scary story.
Yeah, when you hear it or read it versus seeing it doesn't induce the same type of physical response because of that intermediary aspect of visualization that doesn't happen. So
exactly.
Yeah, I read that study and it's fascinating. So yeah.
Very, very nice study. So those are two approaches. Then the third one, which is I think sort of the most technical, has to do with a technique which Joel Pearson has developed to measure the strength of imagery, which involves using binocular rivalry. So typically, if you show an image to different images to the two eyes,
okay.
So the left eye sees one, the right eye sees the other. Our brains don't normally fuse those images; they switch between them.
Yeah,
so you'll see one, then see the other, see one, see the other. Joel realized that if you ask people to visualize before you show them the images, you can bias the percepts. So if you're shown a red square in one eye and a green triangle in the other, if you imagine red square before you're shown anything, that's going to bias you towards reporting red square. But that effect doesn't occur in people with aphantasia.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my.
Oh, this is just amazing. I'm stunned at the kinds of differences there are. Kurt, I had no idea you were suffering so much in your life.
I'm not suffering at all. This is the thing. Is like
we should come on to that. But that work was very reassuring to me because clearly, one response to the news about aphantasia was, well, how can anyone possibly know what's going on in someone else's mind?
Yeah.
Surely this is a matter of semantics. People simply are using different words to describe the same experience. But I think work like Joel's shows that, no, that's not right. People are actually identifying genuine differences in experience which correlate to behavioral differences. Yeah,
it is one of the interesting things. When I do talk to people about this, they have a really hard understand. It's difficult for them to understand how people operate in a way that is unaccustomed to them, and they do come back to me and, oh well, you just interpreting this different, or they're trying to tell me that I'm not I actually do visualize. I just don't, see it as visualization. And I'm like going, I really don't. I don't have that ability. So with that, one of the things that people say is like, then how do you go about life? How do you remember things? How do you do different things? And I know that some of the work that you've done is kind of looked at, what are some of the limitations, but what are also some of the potential advantages and the differences in how people actually behave in the world with these two styles, and even going so far as to the types of occupations that some people take on. Can you talk a little bit about that research?
Sure. So this was a rather nice and sort of, to me, unexpected but very straightforward finding. So we just asked the people who've been in touch with us. So I should say, after we described those 21 folk, following Carl Zimmer's article in Discover and coined the term aphantasia, we were then contacted by many thousands. I had about 16,000 people get in touch. So quite a large post bag. And we responded so far as we could in just the same way, by asking people to complete vividness questionnaires and asking them some common sense questions. And one of those questions was, what do you do? And it turns out that if you have aphantasia, you are a bit more likely to be working in science, maths, IT. I guess you might regard them as sort of more abstract.
Okay.
Way. Whereas if you are hyperphantasic, you are a bit more likely to be working in what is conventionally regarded as a creative industry.
Yeah.
I should say there are many, many exceptions. So these are just statistical trends, but they're there. And I think that's quite interesting. Clearly, aphantasia isn't a disadvantage in the sense that people are leading very productive, successful careers. And as time's gone by, we've been contacted by highly impressive aphantasic people, including Ed Catmull, the recently retired president of Pixar, who won the Turing Prize for his work in computer animation, and Craig Venter, who entrepreneurial geneticist, who I think was the first person to decode the genome, Blake Ross, who founded and created Mozilla Firefox. So very successful people getting by without any imagery.
Yeah.
So can reassure you about that. Also, interestingly, in our more recent, so we published one paper on the basis of questionnaire data, and we then went on to do a study in which we actually gave people some behavioral tests and did some brain imaging. And there's a small difference, but the people with aphantasia have a slightly higher IQ than people with hyperphantasia.
Tim, there you go. Yeah.
I was waiting for that shoe to drop, honestly, Adam.
At least in this small sample. So no sort of big disadvantage in terms of day-to-day life. The one area in which there is a kind of deficit, I think, is autobiographical memory.
Yeah.
Again, not in everyone, but it seems that very commonly people with aphantasia just have a bit more trouble pulling out the details of episodes from their past lives. It's not necessarily a disadvantage, I guess. There are things you want to forget, but autobiographical memory seems a little thinner.
Well, I know there's been some research too in patients with PSTD and some of those elements, the potential positive of not having the ability to visualize that, and maybe some protection against some of those types of kind of elements.
Yeah, so I think this is mainly at the level of anecdote, at least so far as I'm concerned still, but it's a very consistent anecdote. So many people with aphantasia have told me, I just seem to find it a little bit easier to move on than others. If I move from one town to another, or if I have a breakup, I don't seem to be quite so haunted by it as my friends and relations are, which makes sense. To what extent it genuinely protects against PTSD, I don't think we really know yet, but it might. That's an interesting question.
Well, so Adam, in talking about all the symptoms and effects, do we know what causes it? Do we know where the source of aphantasia is?
So we don't really. We know quite a bit about the network of regions in the brain which is involved in visualization in normal folk, and you can kind of guess. So it certainly involves visual areas. When people visualize, they do seem to activate visual areas to not as strongly as when they're actually looking, but nevertheless to a detectable degree. So visualization is a kind of echo of vision. But when people are visualizing, they are also activating areas in the frontal and parietal lobes, which are involved in cognitive control, because they're kind of making a decision to do this with their minds. And they're also often activating areas which have to do with language and memory, partly because of the nature of the tasks involved when you get people to visualize. Now, we know that MX failed to activate those visual areas when he was invited to visualize. So there's one piece of the jigsaw. And then in our recent study published last year, we had one finding which I think I found very interesting, which involved resting state fMRI. So this is where you just get people to lie in the scanner and chill. Their brains remain active, and it's possible to look at the brain's networks, which continue to sort of tick over, and to look at their interconnections. And we found that in people with aphantasia, there were weaker connections between regions at the front of the brain and visual regions than in people with hyperphantasia. And what that rather suggests is that in people with hyperphantasia, if you have a thought, it's kind of more likely to translate naturally into an image, because you have, speaking crudely, thinking areas of the brain are more strongly connected with seeing areas than in people with aphantasia, where those connections are weaker. So I think my money would be on differences in connectivity being relevant. And it may be that they have at least some weak genetic basis, because another finding from our questionnaire work has been that there does seem to be an increased likelihood of aphantasia in relatives of people who are aphantasic, and an increased likelihood of hyperphantasia in close relatives of people who are hyperphantasic.
That's fascinating. I do want to reach out to my siblings and just make them take the VVIQ and say, all right, see if there's any connections there as we're doing this. I find it interesting. So I am one of those who I dream visually, right? I have very strong visual dreams, and it's actually one of the things that moment between like waking and sleeping that I know I'm about to sleep, because I'm starting to see things in my mind's eye, and I can that it's a really interesting piece of having this cognitive element around that. But the voluntary part of trying to visualize versus that involuntary part, what is some of the findings, or what are some of the things that you're seeing there? Because again, with people like me, and I know you said there's obviously others who have a full lack of the visual as well as other sensory components. I can, the music part is fine, smelling, all of those things. I can imagine what a steak smells like and different things like that. But the involuntary versus voluntary part is always fascinating for me.
Yeah. So we can't really offer answers from our own research, but I think it's possible on the basis of what we know about the differences between those states to speculate at least. So if I ask you to visualize an apple, that involves the efforts to do so is going to involve engagement of those frontoparietal brain regions which are involved in cognitive control, which, if you were able to visualize an apple, would sort of kick your visual system into action, having consulted memory to access what apples look like, and it would then use that knowledge from memory to drive some activity in the visual system, which then would, if you could visualize, give you that nice image of a red or a green apple, whichever it may be. So essentially, you're driving the visual system backwards, top down, when you visualize. Dreaming is probably very different. Dreaming is much more of a bottom-up brain state. So the neurochemicals involved in controlling dreaming, and much of the brain activity involved in dreaming, sort of comes from the brainstem, and then the activity from the brainstem is propagated up into the hemispheres, rather than the top-down process, which is operating when you're visualizing or trying to visualize voluntarily. So that would be my caricature of the difference between the two. Dreaming is bottom-up, voluntary visualization is top-down. One of the interesting things is that there are many intermediate states, aren't there, like reading a book. So when you read a novel, or at least when I read a novel, I haven't decided to visualize, but it happens. What about you? If you read a novel, do you enter any kind of visual world?
I don't think so. I haven't actually ever really thought about the reading part of this and visualizing. Do I visualize it? Or again, is it more of the, when I describe something, I can describe it because of, it feels to me like when you were talking top down versus bottom up, I've been trying to think about this for the past couple of weeks, because knowing that this interview is coming up, and like, how do I describe this? It's like, there's a wall going up between what the visual is. I know there's the visual image across, on the other side of that wall. And I could, I tell people it's like reading a story is what I typically do when I think of something and try to remember. It's like reading that story. It's not the visualization. It's not a movie. It's the reading of a book. And so I don't, but actually in reading a book, I haven't really thought about, I'm going to have to go and read a novel and see if what actually occurs. So there you go.
So many people with aphantasia have said that they don't really enjoy reading novels which have long descriptive passages because they just don't do anything for them. And another nice anecdote, which again has come up again and again, is people with aphantasia saying, I never have that problem in the cinema when a character from a book appears and other people say, gosh, he doesn't look anything like I thought he did. I never have that.
Oh, that's another good thing. So I wonder if that's why I don't like long poetry that is very, evocative of imagery and various different things. It just doesn't do anything for me. So anyway.
Adam, first of all, I'm so grateful for you as a science communicator. I mean, you're a scientist first and foremost, but the fact that you thought about, well, you had this conversation with a friend and Aristotle used this term and with Aphantasia and Aphantasia, like you're developing terms and you're speaking in ways that are really accessible. And you don't have to speak that way. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for doing that, because I think it's an important part of the science communication story. But you said something that really caught my attention a few minutes ago, and forgive me for jumping back, but you said visualization is an echo of vision. And I think that's a really cool idea. Could you spend just a minute to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably has quite wide applicability beyond vision. So, and I guess one of the special things about human beings is that we live a lot of our lives in our heads. We spend a lot of our time offline, don't we, in one way or another. And what seems to be happening when we're offline is that we're simulating the world using the systems which at other times we use to engage with the world. So, if you're an athlete, you might spend an hour or two rehearsing your next run or your next javelin throw, whatever it may be, and you're going to be using your motor system to do that. If you're a musician, you may well be running through a concerto you're going to play, and you'll be using the parts of the brain that are involved when you're drawing your bow across your violin, but also parts of the brain that are involved in listening. So we have this capacity to engage offline brain regions, which just those brain regions which we use when we're performing activities online. I think it's a rather sort of fundamental fact about human brains.
Yeah. That's fantastic. It really is. It's a great reminder that even though we're out in the world, we have the ability to be inside, our heads and playing stories and thought processes and decisions and imagining, future decisions and past decisions.
Lots of future thinking. That's right. I mean, I think as part of the story, which maybe I haven't mentioned, the kind of foundation for what I've said is that, of course, even our perceptual experience is highly creative. Mm. We only experience the world because our brains are metabolizing sugar and oxygen and doing all. That experience is an act of creation.
Yeah,
and imagination is a kind of recapitulation of that act of creation. And in a way, imagination begins to look a bit less strange when you realize that what we do when we imagine is rather like what we do
doing it when we're actually,
when we just experience the world.
Yeah, we're always, thinking about human behavior in just different pieces. One of the things that Tim and I often, in the work that we do, is just visual illusions and the way that our brain sees something, even when it's right in front of us, that if you take a closer look at it, nope, that's not what's actually happening. Again, because of exactly what you're talking about, our brain is interpreting things and making its own judgment upon things that aren't necessarily what is actually there. So
I guess dreaming is the most straightforward example, isn't it? We're completely offline, and yet we are making up storylines and enjoying experiences without the benefit of any sensory input at all.
From the bottom up, no
from
less.
The bottom up, yeah. All right, I know Tim is jonesing to talk about music, but I have one question before we get to there. And this is a purely selfish question, and I think I already know the answer. But if there's any other people who are listening who have aphantasia like me, that's lifelong, has there been anybody that has identified on moving from having aphantasia to being more normal in being able to visualize with their mind's eye? Has that ever happened? I believe it's happened with some people who have had it happen because of like MX through some other elements. But is there any from a lifelong congenial aspect of that?
Yes, I think if that happens, it's very, very rare.
Okay.
And quite a lot of people have said that they've tried various mental exercises to see if they can cultivate their imagery, and they haven't succeeded.
Yeah, that's me. That's me. I've been trying. So
that does suggest that there might be some biological limitation, I think. Yeah. But I emphasize again, it doesn't seem to be a handicap. People are highly creative, imaginative, productive, despite the lack of imagery. One footnote to that, which is perhaps worth mentioning because it came as such a surprise to us, is that there's quite a large community of aphantasic artists.
Oh.
I think I and my colleagues had assumed that if you were aphantasic, you probably wouldn't be that interested in the visual world. But actually, on the contrary, there's a largish group of artists who say that they think their aphantasia is a kind of stimulus to artistic creativity, because if they want to see what things look like, they have to make them.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Yeah. I love that. I absolutely love that. Well, I wanted to jump back to our speedrun question about having dinner. What you said you'd probably choose a musician. Is there anyone that came to mind that you'd like to have that dinner with?
Well, I recently had a conversation with David Gray. Do you know? He perhaps there's an English.
Oh, yes. No, I know him well. Yes.
And that proved very, very stimulating. He was an extremely good conversation partner. So I think that's partly why, and I like his music. That was partly why I came up with that choice.
How did you come to just have a conversation with David Gray?
Well, I'm writing something which touches on imagination and creativity, and I wanted to speak to a creative musician. And because I like his work, I got in touch and tracked him down with some difficulty, but eventual success. It was worth doing.
Fantastic. So if you were, let's play this out just a little bit in your personal life. If you were to be stranded on a desert island for a year, what musical artist would you take? One or two musical artists library would you take with you?
Yeah, well, curiously, in our run with this conversation, you said that I wasn't allowed to take Bach himself.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
But I would take his music, I think.
Bach comes to mind. Okay.
I would take the preludes and fugues and the partitas, and I can't really imagine better company.
Yeah,
there's something very, very sort of intimate and conversational about Bach's.
Yeah. Well, for good reason. My God, I mean, he changed the course of the Romantics, but all more classical and serious music for the next several hundred years. So, anybody else?
Well, there's such a choice, isn't there? Maybe I'd take Mendelssohn. I think the Mendelssohn Octet would keep me very cheerful.
So interesting. Wow.
I have a violinist daughter, and I loved listening to her play that. So.
That is fascinating. I would have guessed more, we know a lot about, Kurt and I talk a lot about decision making and how we're novelty seeking. And so, I kind of would have anticipated something more like pop music or something from a musician from your childhood or something like that.
Yeah, I guess I'm fairly omnivorous. I like. I've spent less time listening to modern music, I think.
Yeah.
David Gray, I'd happily take along.
Well, you're on a desert island. You're probably only having, coconuts to eat. So you might as well just have one type of music too. So there you go. Adam, before we go, I do want to ask you just if you can talk a little bit about some of the other things that you're doing. You have the Eyes Mind Project, as well as the Extreme Imagination Conference. Just kind of, can you give us a quick overview of what both of those are and what you're trying to achieve with those?
Yeah, sure. So the Eyes Mind Project was an interdisciplinary project. Curiously, it was funded by our Arts and Humanities Research Council rather than by a science organization. They were trying to encourage scientific work that would involve people from the humanities. So it was actually a really enjoyable group. We had an art historian called John O'Nyans, who actually is he's the world's first neuroart historian. He created the discipline of neuroart history. A philosopher, Fiona McPherson, who's a sort of philosopher of perception, an artist, Susan Aldworth, a postdoc who's a cultural historian, Matthew McKissick, and a neuroscientist. And we worked together. The group is sort of just in existence. We need another grant, I think, to we have a healthy existence. But we worked for 4 or 5 years together, and I've been involved in a number of interdisciplinary ventures, and they sometimes don't work. But this one did, because we were all genuinely interested in each other's points of view, and we're willing to spend a bit of time learning about the kinds of approaches we took. So we worked together. Our remit initially was threefold. So to get a grant, it's probably the same in the States. To get a grant, you have to promise a lot.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we promised we would read everything that had ever been written about visual imagery and then kind of condense that into a history of previous thinking, which we did. We promised that we would do a meta-analysis of brain imaging studies of visualization, which we did. And we promised that we would create a register of people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia, which we began work on. So that was the Eyes Mind group. And I would say that the kind of discovery or rediscovery of aphantasia, because actually Francis Galton knew about it in the 19th century, has opened a huge number of windows. I think there's an enormous number of questions to investigate in future about the behavioral associations, the psychological and psychiatric associations, the neural basis, the genetics. There's masses to do. Then the Extreme Imagination Conference grew out of the work of the Eyes Mind group. We thought that it would be good to bring together people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia. So I think the first meeting was 2019 in Exeter, which is where I'm based. And we had about 130 or 40 participants. And it was great fun. I was slightly worried that we might have one group of people in the room who were feeling a bit hard done by because they didn't have imagery, and another group who were feeling rather pleased with themselves because they had lots of it. But in fact, it was very nuanced. People were very sort of open to the idea that there might well be advantages and disadvantages both ways. And I guess that kind of created the beginnings of a community, which I think seems to have prospered since then. There is now an organization called the Aphantasia Network, which has a large number of people visiting its website, and that held another conference virtually last year, which kind of picked up on our first conference. So I hope there will be other similar meetings in future, not least because certainly the research that we've done has been very dependent on public involvement. We've really relied on people getting in touch through the web and then giving their time, which we're very grateful for.
Yeah, so if any of our listeners are interested, we'll put a link into the VVIQ so that they can go out, because anyone can go and take it. And so we'll make sure that is available if you think you're hyperphantasia or aphantasia, or even if you're just a normal Joe like Tim, you go out and take it, because I think it adds to that body of research and information that you guys are collecting. So, and
if you visit the Eyes Mind website, you'll find a link to our questionnaires.
Perfect. That'll be great.
We'll make sure we have the link
in there. Adam, thank you. This was, as Tim mentioned earlier, the Me Search piece. I mean, there was a Me Search thing for me on this, just because, it's been an interesting journey, because I've only really realized this probably in the last 4 or 5 years, that there is a difference between how I view things in my imagination or not view things in my imagination versus the vast majority of people. And so wonderful insights from you. And thank you for, as Tim said, you are articulate and able to communicate this in a way that I think, everybody is able to understand and get value from. So thank you.
Well, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to speak.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Adam, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever comes into Tim's very visual brain and my pretty blind eye brain. There we go.
Yeah, we are different in that way, aren't we?
We are. Well, and I have to give credit to you, because you were the one that, when we were at one of the meetups that we were doing, and you had parked your car and you had forgot something, or we had to go back to it, and you were describing to me where it was on your car, and I'm like going, well, that's pretty specific. And you were like going, well, yeah, I see it right there. And I'm going, what do you mean you see it right there? And you go, well, yeah, I close my eyes and there's the car and where it's parked.
No, really?
And I'm like going, no, it's just kind of like a metaphor, right? No, you were going, no, I can see where the car is parked and all of these things. And I'm going, and the way that you described it to me was really one of the first times I realized that my metaphor, like everybody talking about, memory as a metaphor, wasn't really a metaphor. It was like, no, you're actually seeing that in your brain and being able to kind of pull up a picture. And I can't do that.
it's just in the last 5 years that you've actually come to just realize, my gosh, this is actually a thing for you.
Yeah, it was probably back in 2018, 19. So
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. So it has been literally, from my perspective, this understanding has blossomed in those years. Before that, it was, again, we all live in our own heads. And I can't live in your head. I can't see what you see. I can't remember how you remember. And so when you describe that, I can only see it or understand it through, how I do things. And so, of course, when you're talking about, I picture this in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, I can. It's a verbal metaphor for how we kind of process this information, but in fact, it's not.
For most people.
For most people, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. So where do you want to, I'm so glad that you reached out to Adam and that Adam agreed to be on. I thought he was a terrific guest and really loved the conversation.
Well, this was research, right? Sorry for the folks who had to put up with this, who are like going, why are you doing this very specific thing? It impacts what Adam was saying that on the aphantasia side, 1 to 2%, on the hyperphantasia side, 2 to 3%. So,
right.
At most 5% of the population.
At opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right? So it's interesting. So I have obviously done additional research beyond this conversation, and that VVIQ, the visual visualizations test that you do, I've taken that. What's interesting is that most people skew to the right. So if we think of a bell curve of that distribution between aphantasia and hyperphantasia, there's more people at the hyperphantasia side of that scale.
Right.
And it skews towards that side. So people in that, 1 to 5 scale, if, 3 would be the absolute normal curve, distribution curve where that comes down, it's going to skew to the right of that. It leans right. So there's less people in the world like me, and even less people who are kind of like me, and more people who have that better visualization on the high end.
And for relative numbers, where does that compare to, like, say, color blindness?
It's about the same, right? So color blindness, I think, is 3 to 6%. According to the notes that you've subsequently put in our show notes here. So I will trust that you got those from a credible source, and we'll go from there.
Yes. Yeah, it was a credible source. I promise.
So, I think it's interesting. And I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is again, this idea that we all live in our own heads, and therefore it's hard for us to get out of our heads and to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes to understand how they're viewing the world. Again, thinking about color blindness. What's interesting about color blindness is you can see visual pictures of what a person with color blindness sees, right? And they haven't really done that with aphantasia. We'll have in the show notes a really cool kind of picture of a horse that has 6 different images, and kind of take a look at that, because that gives you a good idea of when people kind of think about a horse, these are kind of different representations of how clear that picture is. And so
within, again, on this spectrum
on a spectrum, it's not a full spectrum. It's just kind of a simple way. Again, this is relatively new, this research. It started in 2015. So it wasn't, so Tim, cool. I couldn't even name this before 2015, even if I had wanted to. So
that is cool. I also think that it reminds me a little bit, just a bit. It kind of touches on to theory of mind, how we believe that we can sort of, that as we become mature adults, that we have some more than just sympathetic feelings. We kind of have an understanding of how someone else might feel. They fall, they cut their, they fall on their hand, they cut their palm, and we go, oh, that must hurt. Like we can sort of get the experience that someone else is having. But with these aphantasic and hyperphantasic experiences at the opposite ends, the average population isn't thinking about this, isn't imagining that when you and I are having a conversation and I say, well, don't you remember this? You could remember it, but the way that you'll remember it's going to be very different from the way I remember it.
Yeah.
And that could impact our conversation.
Or if you're doing an exercise, like in a workshop that says, all right, close your eyes and visualize this,
right.
Which is oftentimes things. It's interesting, like in meditation and different things.
Relies on visualization,
right? A lot of that is visualization, which I can't do. What's the memory technique where you go in and you're supposed to visualize, like walking into your house and putting something where you put your keys and doing different pieces of that. It has a name.
I don't know the name of it.
I can't remember what that name is. And I remember for years trying to do that. And I'm like going, it doesn't work. I can't get it. Now I understand why, because I'm not doing it, because it's not in my brain the same way that it is in the brain with others who are doing the memory technique. Oh, if I just walk into the house and where I put my keys, that's where I'm going to remember, this story that we just heard, or this different piece of the thing. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I think that has implications, not just in our personal life, but if you are a leader in an organization, if you are doing any sort of training, if you are a salesperson, lots of different things within organizations, and that has an impact on that. So
I just want to double down on that. This is a diversity and inclusive kind of an issue. I don't mean to be overstating it, but seriously, the leaders need to be self-reflective, and they need to be empathetic. And I think the more we understand about the diversity of the way a brain processes information, the better we can be at communicating with each other.
So are we going to have to make this a woke issue now that oh my gosh, we're going to have to do the Aphantasia training at our organ? No, we're not.
No, we're not going. I'm not advocating that, but I think it's just it's another star in the constellation of what makes us unique.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, is that, and I think this is a bigger, broader piece, is that constellation of stars that make up who we are. We think we know what the constellation is, but if you have seen a picture from the James Webb telescope and you kind of look at that blank sky between the two stars, it is filled with other stars. And that's exactly what we as people are, is that, there's some bright stars that shine out when we look at somebody, but you have to understand that behind those stars are a multitude of other stars that we can't see. And I think that's a really cool piece of that. So
agreed.
All right. Well, I think we can maybe wrap up this whole episode on that constellation kind of point there. So thank you, folks. We hope that our conversation with Adam helps bring some light, shine some of that starlight on this fascinating and diverse way that we connect ourselves to this amazing world we live in. Aphantasia really impacts the way that the world is experienced, at least for me and others like me. And we're glad that we can share Adam's work with you, so maybe you can understand it a little bit better.
Yeah. And as we mentioned in the introduction, we really just want to say thank you to listeners who take time to give us those quick 5-star ratings or short reviews, because together these two things end up helping a lot of other people find behavioral grooves when they're not really sure what show they should listen to. So thank you to everyone who does that.
Yeah, so we hope that this conversation helps you visualize in your brain how you can go out and find your groove.